Welcome to the Western Bound podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled Teachings of Dune, Clues for Living Like a Human, from the writings of Frank Herbert. The talk was given by Bandhu Dunham on March 16, 2024, via Zoom. Bandhu is the author of Creative Life and an internationally recognized glass artist and teacher. In this talk, he explores some of the major themes threaded through the Dune series that can be of spiritual value to consider. For those not so familiar with Dune, Frank Herbert wrote 6 books in the science fiction series based 20,000 years in the future, after humans had colonized planets throughout the universe. The House of Atreides is set up by the Emperor, who conspires with the House of Harkonnen to eliminate the Atreides after they are sent to govern Arrakis, the only planet in the universe with spice, the most valuable substance in existence, which extends life and expands awareness. Arrakis is a desert planet where stillsuits must be worn to preserve moisture, and which is inhabited by giant sandworms and natives known as Fremen, who have been influenced by the Bene Gesserit, a powerful political sisterhood trained in powers that they use to influence humanity's evolution over centuries. Their plan has been to breed the Kwisatz Haderach, a male messiah who will have prescient visions. Major characters who Bandhu refers to during the presentation include Paul, heir to the House Atreides, who is also known as Muad'Dib, which means desert mouse, and who follows his destiny and comes to be recognized as the Kwisatz Haderach. Jessica, Paul's mother and a member of the Bene Gesserit. The Reverend Mother Mohayim, the spiritual leader of the Bene Gesserit, who puts the 15-year-old Paul through a test of pain before he goes to Arrakis, where he survives the attack by the Harkonnens and retreats into the desert. Baron Harkonnen, a mortal enemy of the House Atreides. Thufir Hawat, a mentat who thinks completely logically, who has trained Paul in the art of combat. Gurney Halleck, who has also trained Paul in combat. Kynes, a planetary ecologist and member of the Fremen. And Chani, Kynes' daughter, who has a relationship with Paul. Princess Irulan is the Emperor's daughter, who after the events that transpire in Dune, has written several books about Muad'Dib, Paul, as a key historical figure in the universe. The Orange Catholic Bible is the primary Orthodox religious text in the universe at the time, which contains elements of most ancient religions. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Bandhu Dunham.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. As Princess Irulan said, the beginning is the time for taking the most delicate care that the balances are correct. And in this circumstance, having the balances correct just means that we all kind of know what we're here for. There's a lot of different levels to Dune. Frank Herbert spent decades researching the thing. So we'll be talking about a couple levels. I'll talk a little bit about the social aspect of what Frank Herbert's perspective was on things, but my main emphasis is going to be what we can each personally use for our own evolution or transformation, whatever that means to you. Here's a quote from Frank Herbert himself in an essay he wrote. He said, "Science fiction, because it ventures into no man's lands, tends to meet some of the requirements posed by Jung in his explorations of archetypes, myth structures, and self-understanding. It may be that the primary attraction of science fiction is that it helps us understand what it means to be human." So that's going to be one of our main things, this idea of being human and what is a human. There's really a lot in the first few pages of Dune. There's so much to talk about. I'm sure it will probably keep us busy for the evening. And then there's some other quotes that I've got to pull out from later on in the books. A little bit about the influences on Frank Herbert and Dune. The background that I've got up right now is actually the Oregon Sand Dunes, which is a national monument or national park right on the coast of Oregon. And Frank Herbert did some research for an article. He wanted to write a magazine article that never ended up getting published, but it was about these sand dunes. Highway 1 that runs up the coast, or 101, whichever one it is there, goes right by these sand dunes, and they kept creeping over the road. And there were government officials, they had an experiment to try and figure out how to control the sand dunes that kept covering the road. And they discovered that they could plant a certain kind of beach grass that would then stabilize the sand dunes so that they wouldn't spread onto the road. And the whole process of this, Frank Herbert looked into in his research, and he found it so fascinating that he became further fascinated with the whole idea of dry land ecology and how human beings can manipulate their environment. That led him on this multi-year course of research while he was doing other things as well to understand sand dunes. He was interested in the way that dunes flow, like water in slow motion and so on. And so there are a lot of things that fed into his whole process. Frank Herbert did a lot of research on different world religions, Islam and Taoism, and also he was very into Shakespeare, Shakespeare's plays and mythology. He was a very serious writer. He did lots and lots of research. After he died, his son, his family, and his son among them, found some of his notes several years later that were in a safe deposit box, 1,500 pages of notes of the whole reality of the Duneverse that he was creating. And Frank Herbert's son got together with another science fiction writer, and they have done a whole series of prequels and sequels. Frank Herbert himself wrote, I think, 6 books in the Dune series, the Dune Chronicles. And there's this thing called Twilight language, which has to do with fiction, I think. Twilight language is the way that mystics speak or shamans speak and describe things in terms that are sort of literal, but also sort of obscure and maybe a little bit hard to understand or requiring a different sort of state of consciousness to understand. So there's a lot of that in Dune. Frank Herbert would write a haiku, or he would write something in poetry, in verse, and then convert it into prose, because he wanted to first establish a certain feeling or context of what he had to say, and then he would translate it into language. And then, of course, there's a lot of poetry throughout the book, some of Gurney Halleck's folk songs and things. And then, of course, the great sayings, little epigrams at the beginning of the chapters, often from Princess Irulan's historical accounts to create the context for the chapters. Frank Herbert learned that trick from another science fiction writer. In science fiction, you have to do a lot of explication, right? You have to explain what's going on here, set the stage. And it can get pretty boring if, as in David Lynch's movie, you just start off by explaining things a little bit literally. So these hints, like in Princess Irulan's statements from these fictional accounts, help set the stage, and they engage your imagination in a way that causes you to want to fill in the gaps. And that's the thing that I find really engaging in the way Frank Herbert wrote. And in all of his writing, other stories, he's done that same kind of thing, where he creates the world, but he leaves out a lot of details. He puts in a lot of details, but then he leaves out a lot of details that force you to try to figure out what's going on, or they at least engage you in this state of uncertainty, of imagination, and sort of twilight state of being present in this reality. How does a still suit work exactly? He describes it a little bit, but it seems like it'd be pretty gross. And these details, he describes certain details, but leaves a lot of other ones out. And the Bene Gesserit are always observing details. And so you get these descriptions of subtle things that then make you want to pay attention of what these other subtle things are. So there's this sort of mystery that Frank Herbert creates at the same time as spinning this reality of his. And that's one of the strengths of it. I was actually a little bit annoyed in the airport somewhere. I was picking up one of the prequels or sequels written by Brian Herbert and Kevin Anderson. The girl behind the counter, she said, "Oh, I'm so glad these guys explain everything that Frank Herbert left out of his books." And I thought, wait a minute. The mystery that has created the gaps that Frank Herbert leaves are actually a very important part of the communication, because they put us in that sort of open-ended twilight state And it gets us to participate in spinning the reality rather than just having the whole thing spoon-fed to you. Yeah, so among Frank Herbert's influences, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia was a big influence. John Carter on Mars. In fact, I read somewhere that the first draft of Dune was set on Mars, and then Frank Herbert decided Mars had been done already so much. Let's go somewhere else. Also, Frank Herbert's parents were like off and on alcoholics. There were like 10 aunts that Frank Herbert had as a child that were Jesuits. And they were always trying to impose their beliefs on him and arguing with him. And he actually credits them with teaching him how to argue in the Jesuit style. And the Bene Gesserit, not too hard to figure out, but that name comes from the Jesuits. So that was one of his main influences. People comment on Dune, the books and earlier movies, they have what's called a white savior problem. There's this storyline of the white savior comes in and sort of rounds up all these savages and rescues them from their horrible fate and leads them on into a glorious future. And that people, perhaps justifiably so, consider that sort of a little bit of a racist perspective or arrogant perspective. Here come these white people to save these other guys and straighten things out for them. I guess it's a little bit inherent if you want to have an adventure story of your hero going to some exotic place and having an adventure. To some degree, that's there. In the movies, the contemporary movies, they tried to address that. They tried to give Chani more agency, for example. And of course, they made the cast really diverse, which doesn't go against anything Frank Herbert said, except changing the gender of kinds. I'm not sure what I think about that, but it gives some more agency to a more diverse group of people. So I think that's a legitimate interest. But this idea of heroes and saviors in general was very important to Frank Herbert, and he talked about it a lot. And in fact, the new movie, they made a point of making Paul a little bit darker, because the first Dune book, when it came out, many people thought, oh, Paul's this hero, he's this great guy, and everything's great, even though throughout the text there's warnings about the problem of messiahs and heroes. And that's actually a major theme for Frank Herbert. So that's one thing to be a little attentive to in the story. It seems like Paul, and he's the protagonist, you want to sympathize, and he's sort of swept up in this destiny that he doesn't have a lot of control over. But also there's this theme of how power corrupts and attracts the corruptible, and how Paul should not just be regarded as some kind of saint throughout this, even though he starts out as an innocent 15-year-old. So there's another quote from Frank Herbert. This is in an interview. And he says, "Don't give over all of your critical faculties to people in power, no matter how admirable those people may appear to be. Beneath the hero's facade, you will find a human being who makes human mistakes. Enormous problems arise when human beings are made on the grand scale available to a superhero. And sometimes you run into another problem. It is demonstrable that power structures tend to attract people who want power for the sake of power, and that a significant portion of such people are imbalanced. In a word, insane. Heroes are painful. Superheroes are a catastrophe. The mistakes of superheroes involve too many of us in disaster. It is the systems themselves that I see as dangerous." So that was Frank Herbert's perspective on heroes, power. There's a common saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But another version of that is that power tends to attract the corruptible. I think Frank Herbert would agree with that idea. Another quote from Frank Herbert, when he was being interviewed by someone, he says, "What I'm saying in my books boils down to this: mine religion for what is good and avoid what is deleterious. Don't condemn people who need it. Be very careful when that need becomes fanatical." So fanatical religion is definitely a theme in Dune that unfolds, certainly in the later books. So I'm going to go on now with the idea of being human and personal transformational elements. This is from page 5 in the edition that I'm reading, one of the most recent ones, There's like 20 editions of Dune out there. Collectors have all of them. So this is a sort of internal conversation Paul is having. He's 15 years old, early on in the book, and he's reflecting on one of the Bene Gesserit lessons that his mother has given him. One does not obtain food, safety, freedom by instinct alone. Animal consciousness does not extend beyond the given moment, nor into the idea that its victims may become extinct. The animal destroys and does not produce. Animal pleasures remain close to sensation levels and avoid the perceptual. The human requires a background grid through which to see his universe. Focused consciousness by choice. This forms your grid. And bodily integrity follows nerve blood flow according to the deepest awareness of cell needs. All things, cells, beings are impermanent. Strive for flow permanence within. So he's describing this lesson that was taught to Paul and I guess to all the Bene Gesserit early on about the difference between human and animal. And of course, early on in the book, Paul is subjected to the test of the Gom Jabbar, which is, as you may recall, the needle at his neck. And the test is to see if he can endure pain and remain conscious enough not to pull his hand instinctively out of this pain-generating box. So a couple of things shortly after the test, which, spoiler alert, he passes the test. Good thing he does, because it's only 5 pages into the book. You don't want to lose your protagonist that early. He was being tested by one of the Bene Gesserit, and she says to him, "You've heard of animals chewing off a leg to escape a trap? There's an animal kind of trick. A human would remain in the trap, endure the pain, feigning death that he might kill the trapper and remove a threat to his kind." So she's pointing out the difference between an animal and a human in that an animal doesn't think ahead. Animal just responds instinctively. Maybe it would chew its own leg off to get away from the trap. But a human has this perceptual grid that they were talking about earlier, this framework within which to organize our perception and interpret things, and might decide to pretend to be dead so that when the trapper comes by, you can kill the trapper and then protect the rest of your species from the danger that is challenging you. So that's one example of how humans are different than animals. And this is what she was testing him for with the Gom Jabbar. Are you a human being? He said that this pain was so intense. And she says, pain, she sniffed. A human can override any nerve in the body. We Bene Gesserit sift people to find the humans. I observed you in pain, lad. Pain's merely the axis of the test. Your mother's told you about our ways of observing. I see the signs of her teaching in you. Our test is crisis and observation. Crisis and observation. And the idea of the Bene Gesserit level of trained observation also runs throughout the book. And it's very crucial for the Bene Gesserit to hatch their plans, and also for anyone with that Bene Gesserit training to understand what's going on about them in this world of plans within plans and wheels within wheels that Frank Herbert creates. There's a lot to keep track of, subtle things that are going on in people's gestures. There's this great scene, which unfortunately they left out of the new movie. I don't know why. I mean, I understand why, because even at 3 hours, you can't fit half the book in there. But there's this great banquet scene. You get a sense of the intrigue among the various actors in the drama on Dune. And it's great, just the way they describe the subtle cues being passed and the plotting and scheming. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. I just get excited thinking about it. But the idea of observation, I want to tie that into a common idea in spiritual practice here on good old earth, which is the idea of self-observation, which is a really powerful and consistent theme in spiritual practice of being able to observe oneself. Gurdjieff said that we should have about 25% of our attention in the outside world and 75% of our attention directed internally. there's not like you have a gauge where you can measure exactly, is it 24%, is it 26%? But you get the idea. The idea is that most of our attention should really be on what's going on internally for us. How am I reacting to my environment? What am I perceiving in my environment? What is the environment trying to tell me that I might not notice because I'm so full of my own cogitations, right? So part of that internal awareness is for the purpose of clearing your attention and your focus so that you can actually see what's going on around you with clarity. So that's one of the skills that human beings can potentially learn to master. There's this theme in the book of Paul's terrible purpose. Early on in the book, Paul's describing this terrible purpose. He has this vague sense that there's a terrible purpose that he is born for, that is calling to him, and he's being drawn to it. Even before the book begins, he has these prescient visions and dreams, and he's just being haunted by what he describes as his terrible purpose. And throughout the first book, the Dune book, his understanding of that terrible purpose, it gets refined, and he comes to understand that it's not something he can really control, although he's trying. He's trying really hard. Actually, you got to give him credit. For the first part of the book, he's trying really hard to avoid fulfilling this terrible destiny because it's not going to be good for a lot of people. There's going to be a lot of bad stuff going down. In the end, it turns out that he cannot. You still have to have sympathy for him, I think, because it's not a fate that he can avoid, even though he ends up doing some kind of dark stuff, having battle drums made from the skins of his slain enemies. That's not in the movies. They reference that in the book. It's one of the things that happens later on in the books. But in an interview, the interviewer said something about this idea of Paul being captured by a destiny and not being without moral scruples, but being kind of carried along in the wave of this. And Frank Herbert said to the interviewer, he said, "You hit on, of course, the way the character of Paul was constructed. It was the conflict between absolutes and the necessity of the moment." So right there in one sentence summary of the construction of his character, it was the conflict between absolutes and the necessity of the moment. That's what Paul is about. So at 15, he had this vague sense of a terrible purpose. And later, he came to recognize this terrible purpose as the inescapable thrust of race consciousness, a momentum that was carrying the whole race forward. And it's actually in direct opposition to the Bene Gesserit scheming. Actually, I'm going to read a couple pages here because it really gives a good overview of the conflict between Paul's destiny and the Bene Gesserit scheming and this major theme throughout the book. But also it just helps bring us back into the sense, that mystical sense of the world that Frank Herbert creates. So I'm going to read directly from this edition of the book. It's going to be pages 13 and 14. It's from the Ace Trade paperback edition from 2005. So anyone can look it up, see what I'm reading. So this is a conversation with Paul, who's just had the Gom Jabbar test, and Reverend Mother Gaius Mahayam. She's the one who gave him the test. We find out later in one of the prequel books written by Brian Herbert and Kevin Anderson that she is actually the grandmother. She would be Paul's grandmother. No one knows that at this point. In fact, Frank Herbert doesn't reveal that anywhere here. Maybe it was in his notes, but it's in one of the other books. So this is a conversation shortly after the Gom Jabbar test has taken place and Paul survived. The Reverend Mother speaks first. She says to Paul, "You hate us a little, eh?" She looked toward the door, called out, "Jessica!" The door flew open, and Jessica stood there, staring hard-eyed into the room. Hardness melted from her as she saw Paul. She managed a faint smile. "Jessica, have you ever stopped hating me?" the old woman asked. "I both love you and hate you," Jessica said. "The hate, that's from pains I must never forget. The love, that's just the basic fact," the old woman said. But her voice was gentle. "You may come in now, but remain silent. Close that door and mind that no one interrupts us." Jessica stepped into the room, closed the door, and stood with her back to it. "My son lives," she thought. "My son lives and is human. I knew he was, but he lives. Now I can go on living. The door felt hard and real against her back. Everything in the room was immediate and pressing against her senses. My son lives. Paul looked at his mother. She told the truth. He wanted to get away alone and think this experience through, but he knew he could not leave until he was dismissed. The old woman had gained a power over him. They spoke truth. His mother had undergone this test. There must be a terrible purpose in it. The pain and fear had been terrible. He understood terrible purposes. They drove against all odds. They were their own necessity. Paul felt that he had been infected with terrible purpose. He did not know yet what the terrible purpose was. Someday, lad, the old woman said, you too may have to stand outside a door like that. It takes a measure of doing. Paul looked down at the hand that had known pain, then up to the Reverend Mother. The sound of her voice had contained a difference then from any other voice in his experience. The words were outlined in brilliance. There was an edge to them. He felt that any question he might ask her would bring an answer that could lift him out of his flesh world into something greater. Why do you test for humans? He asked. To set you free. Free? Once, men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free. But that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a man's mind, Paul quoted. Right out of the Butlerian Jihad on the Orange Catholic Bible, she said. But what the OC Bible should have said is, thou shalt not make a machine to counterfeit a human mind. Have you studied the Mentat in your service? I've studied with Thufir Hawat. The Great Revolt took away a crutch, she said. It forced human minds to develop. Schools were started to train human talents. Bene Gesserit schools? She nodded. We have two chief survivors of those ancient schools, the Bene Gesserit and the Spacing Guild. The Guild, so we think, emphasizes almost pure mathematics. The Bene Gesserit performs another function. Politics, he said. Kul Wahad, the old woman said. She sent a hard glance at Jessica. I've not told him, Your Reverence, Jessica said. The Reverend Mother returned her attention to Paul. You did that on remarkably few clues, she said. Politics indeed. The original Bene Gesserit school was directed by those who saw the need of a thread of continuity in human affairs. They saw there could be no such continuity without separating human stock from animal stock for breeding purposes. The old woman's words abruptly lost their special sharpness for Paul. He felt an offense against what his mother called his instinct for rightness. It wasn't that the Reverend Mother lied to him. She obviously believed what she said. It was something deeper, something tied to his terrible purpose. So there's a lot right there, a lot of atmosphere right there, but it just lays out the themes here. At first, right after Paul's had the test, he's talking to the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother, and Herbert describes this experience, which reminds me of experience I've had with spiritual teachers, with my own teacher and with other teachers. Just this description of the experience of being with someone who's at perhaps a higher level than you. And then it all falls apart later when she explains more about their vision. He realizes that it conflicts with something that is in his destiny. But he says, Paul looked down at the hand that had known pain, then up to the Reverend Mother. The sound of her voice had contained a difference then from any other voice in his experience. The words were outlined in brilliance. There was an edge to them. He felt that any question he might ask her would bring an answer that could lift him out of his flesh world into something greater. I don't know how many people listening or watching here have had that experience of encountering a person. And it can even happen, I think, with someone who's not like a, quote, teacher, in quotes, when there's a certain circumstance created, what's sometimes referred to as a chamber, in which there's a presence embodied in a person or embodied between people, where there's an availability of higher knowledge that's present in a space. And that can be invoked by the consciousness of one person or by what can happen between people or a group of people when their attention is directed at, we could say, a higher level of reality. And something can invoke when the words that people are saying are edged in a kind of brilliance. I think if you engage in a conscious spiritual path, you will have that experience at various times. And I think there are levels to it. There's a saying that when a student is ready, the teacher appears. And I think there are different levels at which we might be ready for a teacher to appear. And they can lead us into different steps of a path we might be on. But even so, as Frank Herbert says, we don't want to give up all of our discriminating faculties. Let's see, what's the exact quote here? Don't give over all of your critical faculties to people in power, no matter how admirable those people may appear to be. So I think there's some degree of our critical faculties that you might hand over to a teacher if you've discerned and tested that this teacher might be someone you can trust in a certain domain. You might hand over a certain amount of your critical faculties, but maybe not all of them. My own teacher certainly never expected people to give over all their critical faculties. But there were times when you do need to proceed on a certain kind of faith, when even though something might feel contrary to my habit patterns, to what's comfortable to me, to what's habitual and familiar to me, I might need to take someone's guidance, someone's advice that I trust. And that's a very vulnerable place to be. But I think it's something that's essential to spiritual progress at various points along the path, especially to be vulnerable to our own self-observation and what we can learn.
I'm just thinking as you're speaking about this, that if one is not vulnerable enough to a person who has a greater knowledge, we're just in a bubble and we won't grow beyond that. But also, if you give over all your faculties, you're like a sheep and you don't learn for yourself. You just take things at face value that other people tell you.
Yeah, there's always that tension. And ultimately, it comes down to your own responsibility. You're ultimately responsible for your own evolution and what you align yourself with. So there's a quote from a Supreme Court judge, Learned Hand, who was a legal scholar. He was talking in political context, but I think it's true in our spiritual work. The spirit of liberty is the spirit that is never quite sure that it is right. There's another quote from Frank Herbert. He said that the people I distrust most are the ones who want to improve our lives for us, but they only have one course of action in mind, meaning they have a dogmatic plan. This is what we're going to do. We're going to burn all the witches. We're going to put the people we don't like into some kind of camp and get rid of them. We're going to expel them. These very rigid plans, which might not seem so sinister at first, but if there's only one course of action, they tend to run down a path that leads towards dissipation, right? So you always need to have this little bit of an edge of not being 100% sure. How do you cultivate faith in a teacher, or even just in your own spiritual practice that you pursue, meditation practice, whatever? How do you cultivate a faith in that while at the same time not losing sense of your own responsibility? That's a paradox that we have to grow into. I don't think as a beginner we may be able to handle that. We have to learn it and learn it through practice and sometimes making mistakes, hopefully not mistakes that are too large. There's a lot of levels, a lot of things to think about. That's one of the reasons why Dune is so popular, I think, because it gives us a lot to think about under different circumstances. So it's not just fantasizing about these weird characters. You notice there's not very many aliens in Dune. All the sentient creatures are people, even ones that have been mutated a little bit. They all start as humans. It's us and the sandworms and the sand, and that's what we're dealing with here. It seems to me very much an intention for us to reflect on human nature throughout these books and what the storyline is telling us. So this is a quote from another one of Princess Irulan's fictional accounts of things. This is a quote from the Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib. And here he's obviously in some kind of a reflective mood because he's not out slaughtering anybody right now, fighting any Harkonnens. He says, there is in all things a pattern that is part of our universe. It has symmetry, elegance, and grace, those qualities you always find in that which the true artist captures. You can find it in the turning of the seasons, in the way sand trails along a ridge, in the branch clusters of the creosote bush, or the pattern of its leaves. We try to copy these patterns in our lives and our society, seeking the rhythms, the dances, the forms that comfort. Yet it is possible to see peril in the finding of ultimate perfection. It is clear that the ultimate pattern contains its own fixity. In such perfection, all things move toward death. So that's a very nice way of saying the theme that is throughout the storyline, which is having a dogmatic fixed idea of how things should proceed. The Bene Gesserit kind of embody that. Having a fixed idea, no matter how beautiful and refined the beauty you're perceiving is, the rigidity of it itself creates entropy. The rigidity of that plan, that conceptual framework, if that framework itself does not evolve and respond to circumstances and changing needs, there is death. In such perfection, all things move toward death. That's one of the main themes. A spiritual teacher, E.J. Gold, has this thing called the way of sacrifice. It's kind of like a 12-step program. Instead of the 12 steps, you have different sacrifices that we must make for our spiritual evolution. And there's one that's the first sacrifice, and it's actually a sacrifice that you cannot make yourself. Most of the sacrifices on the path you have to consciously make. The first sacrifice is one that has to be made for you, and it's called the sacrifice of peace of mind. The story of Paul, especially this early part of the book, reminds me of this sacrifice of peace of mind. The idea is that we're raised with a certain worldview, and we're raised to feel comfort in the structure that is handed to us. Our conventional training, society's framework lays out what our roles are and what our possibilities and potentialities are. And that conceptual framework is very nice for creating an order and organizing things, and certainly not something we might want to throw out haphazardly. But there's something dangerous in it, which is the peace of mind that it gives us. Because the peace of mind that our societal framework offers us is an illusion. Because really, you look around and there's random things that happen all the time, circumstances that happen. So peace of mind is actually something that does not serve us very well if we want to enter a path of any kind of conscious spiritual evolution. Peace of mind is one of the first things that has to go. There's a scene in the book early on where Christopher Howard is looking at Paul, or maybe it was Gurney Halleck, one of those two guys, was reflecting on how Paul, at age 15, is about to enter manhood kind of earlier than he ought to have to because of circumstance. He's going to lose his peace of mind. And that actually, that's not such a great thing. But then again, we can't evolve without losing peace of mind.
Well, religion or spiritual teaching can create peace of mind too. It depends on how it gets used.
Yes. So that's the difference between religion that might be for the purposes of placating the masses and something that might be about spiritual evolution. Yeah, and that also is the theme of organized mass religion and fanaticism that Frank Herbert talked about, which again is a theme of the great jihad that comes after Muad'Dib comes into his ascendancy as the emperor of the known universe. Also, I want to mention about this idea of peace of mind is a quote from Princess Irulan. Okay, she's reflecting on Paul and Muad'Dib. I think this is the quote we had up at the beginning on the screen. Muad'Dib learned rapidly because his first training was in how to learn. And the first lesson of all was the basic trust that he could learn. It's shocking to find how many people do not believe they can learn, and how many more believe learning to be difficult. Muad'Dib knew that every experience carries its lesson. So there's no experience we have that doesn't have a lesson for us if we're willing to learn. Idris Shah is a Sufi teacher. He had a whole book called Learning How to Learn. As that title might imply, one of his main points was that we need to know how to learn, how to process our environment in order to learn. And that ties back again to that idea of having our attention 25% on the external world and 75% on our inner world, so that we have some awareness of how we're interpreting things and how we're processing things. So our next theme here is water discipline, or discipline in general, we might say, and warriorship. Warriorship is a theme that we often encounter in different spiritual paths. We find it in Buddhism, the teachings of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He talks a lot about warriorship. He's got a whole book on the spiritual path of the warrior, which is really great. Carlos Castaneda's books, which I'm very fond of, although there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Castaneda made up a lot of stuff, but I don't care. When I read Castaneda, it might as well be a true thing. It's like Dune in the sense that it carries you into a reality that has an internal consistency that can be useful information for anyone on that spiritual path. So discipline, the water discipline that they talk about in Dune, it basically boils down to mindfulness. And mindfulness, not just in the hip pop psychology sense of being more mindful so you can be a little bit less stressed out at your job, so that you can be a more efficient cog in the wheel of corporate America. That's not the level we're talking about, although it can begin with something like that. But just mindfulness to the minutiae of your environment, observation of minutiae and mindfulness about minutiae are a real theme throughout Dune of how the Bene Gesserit are observing the minutiae of things and finding important clues in that. But also water discipline on Dune is all about keeping track. And Frank Herbert makes this point, not just of water, but of moisture. He said that's a very critical difference in what is being attended to. Not just water, but moisture. The vapor in your breath. You got your still suit, you got your filters on, your nose and everything, because you want to capture every bit of moisture. And moisture becomes a very subtle thing to perceive. My teacher was always making a point of simple things that can be very valuable tools for training awareness and consciousness, like remembering to turn off lights. I know your mother used to nag you to turn off lights, so maybe it's something you don't want to incorporate into your spiritual practice, although my teacher also had a saying about how your mother was right. That's a whole part of another teaching of his on the divine path of growing old. But simple things that we can pay attention to, like turning off the lights, are very valuable for cultivating a sense of mindfulness. I remember reading an article not too long ago. It's one of these articles that pop up in Pocket or something when you open up your browser on the internet, and it said, remember how your mom used to tell you to turn the lights off? Forget it. It doesn't matter anymore because LED lights are so efficient. Oh, don't worry about wasting electricity by having the lights on. I thought, if I didn't cut my hair so short, I'd be pulling it out. Because one, it doesn't matter if you leave the lights on because the amount of electricity is so small. Misses the whole point. And two, paying attention to anything you can just forget about, that it's not valuable in and of itself to pay attention to something like turning lights off. The reason to turn lights off isn't so much about the cost of electricity per se, but the fact that it's a resource that's being used when it's not needed to be used. That's a very important principle. It's like Thufir Hawat telling Paul never to sit with your back to the door. It doesn't matter if there's no danger in the environment. You should never sit with your back to the door, period. You should cultivate that as a habit, he says, because you don't want to have to think about that. You don't want to be making a decision about that. That should be something that's ingrained in your what's sometimes called habit body. Same thing with turning off lights. Very valuable to remember to turn off lights when there's no one in the room. What's the point of having the light on in the room when there's no one there? The fact that it doesn't matter to be doing something wasteful is irrelevant. The fact is that it's wasteful of resources, and we should have a certain kind of respect for our environment, for our resources, that cultivates a personal mindfulness and a personal kind of integrity. There's a lot of energy that we can cultivate and save for ourselves simply through mindfulness. And mindfulness can exist on higher and higher orders, so that we're not just mindful of the electricity that we might be using or the litter that we might be dropping. Mindfulness of our personal energy field, what Castaneda called personal power. And by cultivating a high level of awareness of our personal power and our own energy field, we gather energies that we can be using for higher purposes, for higher transformation, and a more refined perception of our environment, the kind of thing that enables us to perceive minutiae around us and within ourselves that we can then use to our profit. So mindfulness about little things might not seem to be a big deal, but in fact, it is something that really serves us. I first read Dune when I was about Paul's age, probably. I was 16, something like that, when I first read Dune. My teacher, who's Lee Loswick, he was friends with E.J. Gold, who was a teacher in California. E.J. Gold's father was a science fiction publisher, published a magazine or books or something. So E.J. was steeped to some degree in the world of science fiction, which is very useful for someone interested in alternate kinds of realities. He was very much into the spiritual potentialities that are expressed in Dune. So he inspired my teacher to become very interested in Dune. And we have a household practice that we do, people living in households to support each other's spiritual practice. Well, we used to anyway. Some of us still do. But he named one of the households Arrakis, and he named one of the households Seleucus Secundus, which is good and bad, I guess, because Seleucus Secundus is supposed to be a hell world. But the idea of Seleucus Secundus is that it is a planet that by its very nature, as a harsh environment, trains people to have a fierce determination and a personal strength that you don't get by living on a soft, cushy planet. So anyway, I was inspired when I read Dune by Baron Harkonnen. He's a very interesting character. He's a bad guy, but he's not just one of these cartoonish bad guys that you encounter so often in fiction. In fact, our first introduction to Baron Harkonnen is that he's got this sort of sophisticated sense of what's going on and this subtle perception of the circumstance and a little, perhaps, regret about having to wipe out the Atreides, even though he hates them. And it's sort of a waste, you know. But the other thing about Baron Harkonnen is, now nobody cancel me because I'm fat shaming, because it's in the book. He comes out of the shadows. You don't even see him at first, but he comes out and he's described as weighing like 400 kilos something, and that his weight is supported by suspensors. So he doesn't have to deal with his own body weight. He's using technology to keep himself comfortable so that he can eat whatever he wants and enjoy unrestrained sensual pleasures. And there's this thing about his character that even though he's very sophisticated, there's a self-indulgent quality that is actually, to my mind, at the core or very crucial to the evil that he embodies. There's this self-indulgence. And it's the same in the way he orders people killed, just randomly on a whim when he gets annoyed. There's a scene in the book where there's an attempt on his life, and he takes out the stress by randomly having a bunch of people killed and punishing the people involved by killing their friends and forcing them to kill people they like. He's bloated not only by the food that he eats, but also by his power. He embodies a certain archetypal gluttony that is itself evil. And that gave me this idea that self-indulgence is actually at the core of a lot of evil. And not only of evil, but to my mind, as an artist, at the core of a lot of just unconsciousness and what could be called bad art. I mean, bad art is sort of a little bit of a problematic phrase. I'm not sure we should really use it, but we use it anyway. By bad art, basically what I mean is art that's self-indulgent. Just want to kind of throw that out. My own personal aphorism that self-indulgence is the essence of bad art. And I think it holds up. There's a thing about discipline in water discipline and warriorship in general about restraint. Restraint is a virtue. In the West, we don't always cultivate it very much. But in Asian culture, I know particularly in Japanese culture, that restraint, enryo, is considered a virtue, a social virtue that is helpful to cultivate. And if we don't have restraint, we tend to make a lot of awkward mistakes and create difficult circumstances for ourselves and others. So there's a thing about restraint, and that ties into the idea of water discipline, that you're not just wasting water. Even automatic reactions like shedding tears for the dead, like crying, you just don't cry. You keep that water. Water is a resource. You don't let go of water. Everything revolves around this need to husband our water, to keep track of it. And the same thing can be said for our personal energies that we lose when we have an indulgent relationship. Another quote from Princess Irulan. This is from her book, her wonderful book, which I hope you've all read, called The Wisdom of Muad'Dib by Princess Irulan. She says, the Fremen were supreme in that quality the ancients called Spannungsbogen, which is the self-imposed delay between desire for a thing and the act of reaching out to grasp that thing. So there's some old German that survived into Galak or whatever it is they're speaking of, Spannungsbogen. And I actually looked that up. It is a real German word. The translation that my computer gave me was tension arc. Tension arc, A-R-C. So the arc of tension, you could say, between the desire for a thing and the act of reaching out to grasp that thing. And that tension there, right there, between the desiring and the reaching out for, that's an interesting one of these sort of liminal spaces. It's a state of being unresolved, which it can be very creative. I think as artists, sometimes we do well to cultivate that unresolved state. In Buddhism, they have an expression called groundlessness, where you're not really settled into a fixed point of view. And again, this ties back to that thing that Frank Herbert said about not trusting people who have a fixed plan of action in mind for making things better for everybody. Because the fixity, the rigidity of that plan itself leads into a death spiral. The stasis of that fixed idea of how things should be leads to death. And that was Paul Muad'Dib's problem with the Bene Gesserit plan, because they had this great idea for controlling the whole genetic human line. We're going to create the Kwisatz Haderach. It's going to be great, right? But Paul realized that there's something else going on. You can't have that fixed rigidity. That has to get broken up, even if it means billions of people have to die. Which maybe that's okay. I don't know. Maybe that's a problem. Yeah. Is it the light path or the dark path? And again, there's some tension there. So restraint, which is based on self-observation, because you can't restrain yourself if you're not able to observe what you're up to, if you don't have 75% of your attention inside. Wow, we've hardly even gone past page 20 in Dune, right? I mean, we've tied in some things that come in later. But you can see how these themes, which are spelled out early on in the book, carry throughout. So if you're reading the books, pay attention to these themes. Pay attention to those first couple chapters. Read them a couple times maybe to get a good idea of what's going to be unfolding. Just a little bit more about this idea of self-observation and being able to have restraint based on self-observation. Just a rhetorical question here. Have you ever met someone who is so busy expressing their feelings that they can't observe themselves or anything else? It's an interesting thing to reflect on. Our desire, our, quote, need to express ourselves gets in the way of a lot of our capacity for observing what's going on around us, certainly observing the minutiae of what's going around us, and even observing ourselves. Mood and inspiration. Okay, there's this famous quote, which always comes out when people talk about Dune. Gurney Halleck is training Paul. They're knife fighting. There's a lot of knife fighting in Dune. And he's training Paul, and he makes this comment at some point. And Paul, you're not fighting to your level. This is terrible. And Paul says, oh, I guess I'm just not in the mood for it. He's 15. 15-year-olds are often not in the mood for things. Right? But Gurney then snaps at him and he says, what has mood to do with it? You fight when the necessity arises, no matter the mood. Mood's a thing for cattle or making love or playing the balisette. It's not for fighting. So this is a central theme of warriorship. We have to be ready to respond like a warrior when the necessity arises. It's not a thing for mood. Sometimes people are under some kind of illusion that they need to be inspired. This comes up in art a lot too, inspiration. People have these ideas of inspiration, that if I'm not inspired, then I'm just not going to do artwork today. Writers often talk about this idea of the fallacy of inspiration. So here's a quote from Frank Herbert again. He's talking about writing, his own writing practice. And he says, a man is a fool not to put everything he has at any given moment into what he is creating. You're there now doing the thing on paper. You're not killing the goose, you're just producing an egg. So I don't worry about inspiration or anything like that. It's a matter of just sitting down and working. I have never had the problem of a writing block. I've heard about it. I've felt reluctant to write on some days, for whole weeks, or sometimes even longer. I'd much rather go fishing, for example, or go sharpen pencils, or go swimming, or whatnot. But later, coming back and reading what I have produced, I am unable to detect the difference between what came easily and when I had to sit down and say, well, now it's writing time and now I'll write. There's no difference on paper between the two. So that's Frank Herbert's experience of writing. You just sit down. When it's time to write, you just sit down and write. There's also in a great book called The War of Art. If you guys aren't familiar with it, it's not just for artists, it's for everybody who has something creative they want to do. The War of Art. And it's written by Stephen Pressfield, but he's commenting on practice of art. And he says, someone once asked Somerset Maugham, a famous writer, if he wrote on a schedule or only when struck by inspiration. I write only when inspiration strikes, he replied. Fortunately, it strikes every morning at 9 o'clock sharp. So that's how it is. If you have some creative project you're working on, you can't necessarily wait for inspiration before you set pen to paper. You just have to create the thing. The creation of the thing is not just the writing itself, but also the creation of the space in which that writing occurs. If you're waiting for the space to be created for you to do your creative project, whatever it is, you are probably going to be waiting a long time. Bukowski has this great poem called Air and Light. It's this great poem about how someone's going to retire. And now that they're retiring, they will have the time to find a space with light and air to do their painting that they want to do. They'll find the perfect studio. They'll be able to sit there and paint. And Bukowski says, no. If you don't create now, if you're not willing to start writing poetry, even though you're lying in the gutter, if you're not willing to work 3 jobs and do your creative work in between, you'll never manifest your creative potential. You have to be willing to do it even under adverse circumstances. You can't just wait for it to happen. It's not going to land in your lap. If it does, I'd be very suspicious of it. Occasionally things land in your lap. But if you're waiting for that, if you're waiting to win the lottery, you're going to be waiting a long time. There's another ancient quote that somehow survived 20,000 years into the future for Lady Jessica to remember. She's having a conversation with herself, and she remembers a line from St. Augustine, who said, the mind commands and the body obeys. The mind orders itself and it meets resistance. It's funny how that works. When you think to raise your hand, it's like there's no difference between your thought and the hand raising. But when you think of something for your mind to do, there's all kinds of resistance that comes up. There's all kinds of diversions and space that's created. It's funny about that. That itself could be a thing to reflect on and investigate. Oh, urine and feces are processed in the thigh pads. Very important to remember. It's just the very practical thing that Kynes is telling people when they're putting on their still suits, that urine and feces are processed in the thigh pads. I don't know. It's just such a great line. I want to put it on a t-shirt or something. It's just this idea that the smelly stuff you have to deal with too. And it gets dealt with in a straightforward fashion in this technology that the Fremen have created. There's not a lot of drama around it, at least not a lot of drama that we get to hear about. It's one of those details that's left to our imagination, but in their world, it's just part of what you have to do. So you have a still suit. Frank Herbert talked about a tension between the law, the kind of moral law that we live under, and also the ethical reality of things. And that, again, plays back into that tension behind the definition of Paul as a character. The tension between the law, what's morally correct, and what's actually called for by the necessity of the circumstance. How do you draw that line? Again, it's one of these things that maybe a teacher or wisdom teachings, a lineage, whatever, can help you figure these things out. But at some point, you're ultimately responsible for your own determination of these facts. And the further along the path you go, the more responsibility you have. It's very unpleasant. A lot of teachings will tell you this, that when you're first starting out, you can make a lot of mistakes in your judgment. And it's okay, you're learning, as is true with children. But as you enter the adult world, childish mistakes don't really cut it anymore. I just wanted to end it with one quote from the Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. He said, Arrakis teaches the attitude of the knife, chopping off what's incomplete and saying, now it's complete because it's ended here.